It's a complicated issue as to why we do books. Only to relieve ourselves of something. One of the creative producing, writing or illustrating a book. And on the very most obvious and conscious level, to produce ethical and read this stuff, that it ought to be good. It ought to be tangible, and it ought to be of the finest truth you're capable of. The only recurring dream in my life, and I don't mean recurring every night, is that every once in a while I will dream of being given a Mickey Mouse toy. And they're the happiest dreams I have, where I wake up and I've actually been someplace like in a 30s store, which is like a tomb, like King Tut's tomb, unearthed in a Brooklyn sidewalk somewhere. It's a perfect stationery store with all those mint condition Mickeys, and I'm getting one for 30 cents in its original box. And I wake up, the Southern Italians or Sicilians, we all lived together. My best friend was Carmine and Nini, who lived next door. And I really had a genuine confusion, which was that Italians were happy Jews. The mothers were all overweight, and they all dressed in dark colors, like black. And the only difference was that the Italian mother, Carmine's mother, across the hall, laughed, and my mother cried. So the Italian Jews were more cheerful, and their food was better. In my case, I came into a family of older siblings, a brother who was 5 when I arrived, and a sister who was 9. We were busy drawing, making up books, reading, doing all the things that alarmed my parents because they preferred healthy, robust children out playing in the streets. So I came into a house of hermits. Happily, I had my 9-year-old sister that in New York City. Those trips were rather nice. It was going in Schrafft's or Longshan's, marvelous, where you had sandwiches, where you had grilled cheese. I mean, incredible things that you could never get at home. But more to the point, you spent the day in New York City. I think being Jewish became significant only in very early adolescence when the war broke out, when I was 13, and actually on the day of my bar mitzvah, which was in June 41. And on the morning of that day, a telegram arrived telling my father that most of his family was dead. There was an agency in New York that sought out Jewish families and tried to trace what was happening in Europe. And the cable arrived on that very morning, and my father collapsed. And of course, all I could see was that my big day was being ruined, and that the years previous to that had been what I call those terrible dead Jew years, where the family was in constant mourning, where that's all one ever heard of, and then being Jewish became a whole different thing. It was paralyzing because I remember we had to get my father, who was in a nearly comatose state, to the synagogue. He went through the whole ceremony, but he wasn't there, actually. And I was a mixture of resentment towards these people for dying on a day that meant so much to me, and terrible guilt for being so shallow and vain as to be so concerned about myself. I think the book that best caught it was Isaac Singer's The Lot of the Goat. And my pictures in that book were a present to my parents because all the characters in it I drew from photographs of these dead relatives. My father's brothers and sisters and my mother's brothers and sisters who never got to this country, who never got out alive, and I made them the characters in Isaac's story. So that the pictures became an homage to these people who had no life at all and were purposelessly killed, and also as a gift to my parents to revive them in some way. In a kind of sentimental way, of course, that is what art is on one level, is that you can revive the dead. You can't regenerate them in some way and use them in some way. And to me, it was maybe personal alleviation of guilt that I had lived and they hadn't. Purely gratuitous accident that I was the one that made it, and those other children didn't. What does that do to an adolescent? I mean, what does that do to you for the rest of your life? It is very hard for me to think of the war. Very hard for me to think of the war, because it blurs out everything.
Everything he sees in childhood is through that light of being an outsider, a little boy growing up in Brooklyn. It was a kind of a ghetto, not in that he was ghettoized, but it was a Jewish community where he lived that was separate from the world at large. New York City was the big wide world, the big windowed world that Maurice went into. Brooklyn was something quite different. It was a separate existence, and childhood is separate from adulthood. Maurice's childhood was a very separate one from the general American experience, and I think his deep perception of that childhood, his feeling of being in some way an outsider, is what informs it, is what gives it its very special quality.
I was not obsessed or goal-oriented that I would become a book illustrator at a certain age or do this or that. I really wanted mostly to work, mostly to earn money, mostly to live on my own and away from my family. That was very critical. So I took any job I could get, packing books for the New York Post. I worked on Pearl Street in a display house where I met my first friends, and some of them have remained my first and best. Then finally the big job at FAO Schwarz, which combined display and windows and meeting people who were interested in books, like Frances Christie, who's a permanent friend, and she ran the book department then. Who cared that you weren't doing yet what you wanted to do, which was illustrating books, which came soon enough anyway. I met Ursula Nordstrom, the biggest and best of them all, who came up to Schwarz, who saw my work, who liked it, and she just took me up. I mean, she just took me up and gave me books to do, and I messed up a lot of the books she gave me, but there wasn't then the worry of doing books for money or doing books even for career. It was doing books like an apprenticeship for fun. I think from the very beginning, I have had a passion for words. And the first books I did since I was the illustrator to other people's words was to embellish those words, make those words look better. Then when you get into the business of picture books where words and language fuse in a way that they don't in ordinary illustrated books, then they both become extremely important. And then language and pictures take on a terrific new meaningful quality, a new essence altogether. And it's a true fusion. And so that when the trilogy like Wild Things, Night Kitchen, and Outside Over There came along, I was putting to use lessons I'd learned through over 20 years of experience of illustrating other people's books and my own stories previous to that, but how to make that fusion complete, how to make it almost seamless so that you don't see where the words end and the picture begins and vice versa. There's a complete joining where you don't see the joints. Well, The Wild Things was the big challenge in terms of it was going to be my first picture book. And I was very feeling imperiled about doing this book because full color book, picture book form. I'd love the picture book form, but I hadn't done it yet. I'd illustrated other people's picture books, but I hadn't done my own. So it had to be a significant work, and only that it had to come thoroughly out of myself. I mean, it had to be a subject that was passionately close to my heart. So what was passionately close to my heart was a kid, and a kid doing something, and whatever that something was what the book was going to be about. It was called Where the Wild Horses Are for a very long time, until I discovered, horrifyingly, that I couldn't draw horses. So I had to change the title. I changed the title various times to things that I could draw, and finally the best thing was things, because that could be anything. And so my drawing ability wouldn't be challenged by anybody. And then what did the things look like? Well, I went back into my head as to who were monsters in my life. Well, they were all my uncles and aunts. Bloodshot eyes and big, huge noses and bad teeth. And they would grab you by the cheek and pummel you and say all the conventional, banal things adults say, like how cute you are and you look so good we could eat you up, and knowing them, they probably could and would. The real problem in that book was the writing of the book and how difficult the writing of the book was. Why would a child turn a page? A child isn't polite. I mean, adults will conscientiously read a book they dislike because they feel they should. Children don't feel any such compulsion. If they hate the first 2 pages, swammo against the wall, that's the end of the book. They don't care if it's won 18 Caldecott Awards, right? Okay. So you've got to catch them. You've got to catch them in a kind of rhythmic pattern, in a kind of syncopation that makes them turn that page. The night Max wore his wolf suit, and it builds, and you trap them. I mean, they can't get out of the book. That's the point of it. It was published to a lot of noise, which I'll skip. I don't think that's very interesting. Criticism and rages and carryings on that this would frighten children. Well, I knew it wouldn't, because it didn't frighten me. And I trusted myself and my own instinct, and it didn't frighten children. And if it did frighten some children, well, okay, perhaps it had to. Perhaps, I mean, why would any one book be good for all children? That's silly. I mean, no grown-up book is good for all people, so we mustn't assume that even a book that wins a Caldecott is appropriate for every child reading it. Then after Wild Things, the next picture book, In the Night Kitchen, was 1970. The reason it took the form of a comic book was because I loved comic books when I was a child. I didn't have children's books. I didn't even know there were children's books until I went to school. And we had to sit in the auditorium and hear Pinocchio read to us and Winnie the Pooh read to us. And I hated them because I didn't like my teachers and I didn't like being told stories where I had to have my hands clasped in my lap. Anyway, Night Kitchen was going to be a comic book, and that was that. And it was going to be simple. It was going to look like Winsor McCay a little bit. It was going to look like Mickey Mouse a little bit. It was going to look like everybody I loved. And it was going to tell a story that obsessed me, which is a story about food, which is a story about why those little creatures at the 1939 World's Fair, those Sunshine Bakers, with their advertisement that says, we cook while you sleep. Why did they do that? Why didn't they wait till I was up? I mean, why did everything good happen when children went to bed? So this was going to be a book about a kid who gets up at night, hears what's going on, and investigates. It just feels wonderful because it has all the energy and zest that a Mickey Mouse cartoon had for me. The action, the power, the movement, the going down, the going up, the scale of it, the logistics of it were a problem. He's in 100 different places. He goes down, he goes up, he goes across pages. So boxes and squares and oblongs and shapes had to be removed and changed to make room for him and the 3 bakers. So the book became a huge, I hope, beautiful garbage pail for memories past and present. And for me, a picture book that had enormous significance and far and away at that time in my life was my favorite. Meant more to me than Where the Wild Things Are. It was much more contemporary in feeling. It was much more appropriate to my grown-up life. Now, like in Wild Things, we are going to do an animated version of Night Kitchen. And Gene Deitch, who did Wild Things, is now working with me on Night Kitchen.
Iris opens and it wipes to the bedroom scene.
That's good.
We have plenty of time to reintroduce that.
We're both roughly the same age, but we grew up with Mickey Mouse and we grew up with an obsession with early Disney cartoons, and he knows as well as I do that the source, or text for this particular look is Disney.
So that we really will first
see
all
we begin to
these
see the
buildings,
city.
right.
Yeah.
And he falls right in with a soft squish. Boom. Right.
To the bakers.
And I use this as a device to cut down, and he reacts in horror.
But he shouldn't react in horror. He shouldn't signal alarm.
I'm glad to hear that. I misinterpreted that.
He should signal cool as a cucumber.
Well, how about annoyance then?
Well, yes, I mean,
little.
he is as smug as in Wild Things.
Or we can look up them like they're idiots or something?
Well, no, but just taking the situation as it comes. As it comes. We have to remember between Wild Things and Night Kitchen was a very significant book, not in the trilogy, but significant for the trilogy, which is Higgledy-Piggledy-Pop, which was written for my darling dog, Jenny, and is the only comic work that I wrote with very serious overtones. It was an It's probably, in many ways, a favorite because it is funny, and I tend not to know how to write funny books. There are no ha-has in any of my work, but there are in Higgledy, I think. And Higgledy was a book with chapters and lengthy prose writing. It prepared me and established me for myself for Night Kitchen that was coming. And then we go 7 to 10 years later, and we're with Outside Over There. But Outside Over There ends up by probably being the most personal of my books and the most vehement of my books. But I'm doing the same thing I did in all my books, which is stuffing in all the things that are significant to me in my life. All the things that happen to me have to get into my work. Sometimes they're very strange things, which I don't understand why they have to get into my work, but like two for instances, okay? Childhood trauma. When I was 2 years old, or 2.5, whatever, I don't remember exactly, the child of Colonel Lindbergh was kidnapped. That their baby could be stolen, the most beautiful baby in America, the most famous baby in America. Well, what does that do with poor little immigrant kids living in Brooklyn? I mean, they can be taken all the time, I guess, if you can't protect a very rich child. So how do you take care of a very poor child? I wasn't smart enough, nor in fact was my father, to stop and think that nobody wanted a poor child. So there's my father protecting us after the Lindbergh kidnapping, sleeping in our room. I remember that. I was so impressed, sleeping in his underwear on the floor to make sure no kidnappers got into the house. So, left a very strong impression on me, sickly child. I could be taken away in many ways, apparently, one of them that way. The book became a way to express, I hope, poignantly the feelings of early childhood. About loss, about being taken away from your parent, about the arbitrariness of life. My subject really, of course, is childhood. And I have only this one theme. How do children get through a normal 24-hour period? With misinformation, sometimes with the correct information, mostly with the wrong information, and mostly having to use their own guts and brains and invention to get through a time period. With very few exceptions, most kids have to make up logic or make up reasons for things in life. Sometimes parents tell them, more often parents don't, for the best of reasons, to protect them from what they think are too frightening to whatever. Kids have to make it up. And I think that's what interests me enormously. How do kids make it up? What do they make up? What does Ida do in Outside Over There when she, for a moment, is furious at being stuck with a baby child, with a sibling? She has to watch, she has to do something she feels some mother ought to be doing. She goes into fantasy. It's a way of getting out of an awkward moment. Because most children think anger, rage, depression they're novel experiences. As adults, we're quite used to them. But when they're brand new, what do they feel like? And what do you do with them when you get them? And what do you do with them when you don't know they're really normal and typical of everyday life? You do something with them. You invent something around them to support yourself while you're going through it. This is what is so miraculous about children, and the healthy instinct that preserves their sanity, that they make something logical out of a moment of illogical emotion. So when I'm doing a book, what I'm mostly interested in is I am caught up in the emotion of the hero or the heroine, and I'm living through that moment. I have the same anxiety attack that Max has precisely when he has it. So what he does is, of course, what I do. I mean, it's my invention, after all. Now, I find that in my present life where I'm designing for the stage, the same thing is happening. I have to find myself somewhere in that. I have to find some point of identification in order to live inside the work. It's wonderful to sit in the audience and see your sets and your colors and your costumes come alive. It's wonderful to hear the audience murmuring, if, God willing, they do, with pleasure. And when they applaud a set, you know, it's as after 30 years of postponed gratification. When you're doing books, you do a book all by yourself in your nice little country house, and you send it out, and it's printed, and you can hear a pin drop. Then you read some asinine review somewhere, either good or bad, but probably still asinine, about your work. And then letters come maybe 6 months later, and your sister calls up and says Mazel Tov or whatever. But that's about it. You've got to be self-supportive and know that you've done what you wanted to do. How different. Now the theater is what's known as instant gratification. The audiences are murmuring. They're applauding the set. They call your name. If they really like the show, you come out on stage. They go, wow, 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 with their hands, and they whistle and scream. It's terrific.
Lifting you in, David. I know, what do you think about it? I always forget.
To have taken that famous, wonderful Yiddish word, the mishigasses of early life, turn them into perhaps art.
Okay, I like
It's very strange because in the case of Higgly Piggly Pop in the book, it is strange enough to see it in 3 dimension with a huge baby sitting on the floor screaming and everybody making notes and scribbling and passing those notes and costume changes and all of that. And my mind is, why are they permitting this to happen? Why haven't they locked me away a long time ago? Instead, I'm treated with great respect and as though this were a normal thing to do. And of course, I'm only being facetious. It is, because it's working out very beautifully. But there's a long chain reaction here that goes all the way back to 1928. And it's being, right now, I have to go back and rehearse a young woman who is acting out something from my childhood. And it's known as an opera. It's amazing.